Miami. This is Dr. John Bennett of Neurosurgical TV, televising another in the student chapter headed by Slaven Gojkovic, a medical student in third year from Zagreb, Croatia. So we'll let it take it from here. Good day, Slaven. Could you please identify yourself and start your presentation? Maybe talk a little bit about the Roton collection before you start reading, please, and welcome.
Of course. Thank you, Dr. Bennett. It's a pleasure to be here again in this, as an invited presenter for the Neurosurgical TV. My name is Slaven Gojkovic. I'm a medical student at the Zagreb University, and I'm currently, I have the honor of leading a student chapter of Neurosurgical TV. This is a great group which contains students from all over the world who are all into neurosurgery and very enthusiastic. So I'm here actually at the seaside of Croatia, beautiful town of Krk. So this will be a special occasion for us as well. So basically what this series are about is that we read chapters of the famous Roton Cranial Anatomy and Surgical Approaches book. This is a famous who is one of the essential works that was published in the year 2000. So we're going to read the official version of the book, which you will see on our screen share, and try to provide with this accompany while people are studying this quite hard material. This idea was brought by myself in conjunction with Rakesh AB, a medical doctor from India, and Tabitha Chazak. She's a young doctor from Romania. So I have the honor to be your presenter today, and I hope you will enjoy this. So if you agree, we can start our picture.
Okay, I'll do that right now. Okay, hold on. Let me open it. Okay, hold on. Okay. And I'll tell you where we're starting it from. Okay, we get the diagram in front of us.
Okay, yes. So this, what you see here is 1.3. This is a continuation from our first reading Roton seminar that we did a few weeks ago. Myself and Rakesh did it. So we will just continue from where we stopped. And today we will start with the discussion on the surfaces of the cerebrum. So this is a continuation of the chapter on the cerebrum, which is I think the most important and the widest topic in neurosurgery. So this is the text of this famous textbook. All that we are using are original editions, so these are both editions. And we are trying to do this to keep the name and fame of Professor Roton alive. So what I'm going to do is start reading this figure now, and I hope you will to familiarize you a bit more with this content. Okay, so figure 1.3 states that it presents lateral, medial, and inferior surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres. Now we will go to the figure A as part of this figure 1.3. So A in the lateral surface. A is lateral view, B is anterior view, C is superior view, D is posterior, E is inferior, F medial surface. Okay, so you get the logic. And now we will start discussing each of these. So in figure A, the longitudinal cerebral fissure that separates the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so this is the longitudinal fissure which separates the two cerebral hemispheres. The lateral surface of the frontal lobe extends from the frontal pole to the central sulcus and is demarcated inferiorly by the same fissure. So the lateral surface of the frontal lobe extends from the frontal pole to the central sulcus on this hemisphere, demarcated inferiorly by the Sylvian fissure between the central and precentral sulcus. Okay, so we have the precentral gyrus, which is one of the important motoric gyri, which is situated between the central and precentral sulcus. Okay, so you can follow just what this picture shows. So you can see here the main central sulcus, which divides the pre and post-central gyrus. So this pre-central gyrus is the M1 area of the cerebral cortex, and it is demarcated by two sulci, and this is the central sulcus and precentral sulcus. Okay, so the precentral gyrus is situated between the central and precentral sulcus. The superior and inferior frontal sulci divide the part of the lateral surface in front of the precentral gyrus into the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. So the superior and inferior frontal sulci divide the part of the lateral surface in front of the precentral gyrus into the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. The inferior frontal gyrus is divided by the anterior horizontal and the anterior ascending rami of the Sylvian fissure into the pars orbitalis, as we discussed in our previous roten show, pars triangularis and pars opercularis. So let me lead you a bit through what this means. So if you notice on the frontal pole of the cerebral hemisphere, pictured on this image A, you can see that we can virtually divide it into three parts. So the most inferior part is now further divided into three distinguished parts. So we have here the pars orbitalis, which is the most anterior part of this most inferior part of the frontal lobe. Okay, so we have pars orbitalis. Behind it, or posterior to it, we have pars triangularis and pars opercularis. This pars opercularis is very important because it creates the opercula, or the coverings of the Sylvian fissure, which is right below. Okay, along with the pars opercularis of the superior temporal gyrus. Okay, so these are basically the three parts of the inferior frontal gyrus. As I said, we can divide virtually the frontal lobe into three gyrus, and inferior. And this most inferior gyrus is further divided into pars orbitalis, triangularis, and opercularis. Okay, I hope you can follow me on this. Okay, so now we are just continuing with this discussion. So we see here that the parietal lobe, which is behind the frontal lobe, is demarcated anteriorly by the central sulcus and posteriorly by a line extending from the superior limit of the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch. So the parietal lobe is demarcated anteriorly by the central sulcus and posteriorly by a line extending from the superior limit of the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch. Okay, so these are some demarcations of the parietal sulcus, of the parietal lobe of the hemisphere. The anterior part of the parietal lobe is formed by the post-central gyrus, which is situated between the central and post-central sulci. So the anterior part of the parietal lobe is formed by the post-central gyrus, which is situated between the central and post-central sulci. This post-central gyrus is a very important sensory area, which is thus demarcated as one, or sensory one area of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, on the next page, this is page 9. We can see, just a second, no, we will just present the same pictures. So now we just discussed the image A, which is on page 8. So please, yes, take page 8.
Yeah, we're on page 8 now.
Great, okay, so now we will just continue to the image B. So here, here is just the continuation of this discussion. So we have the area behind the postcentral sulcus is divided by the intraparietal sulcus. Okay, so the area behind the postcentral sulcus is divided by the intraparietal sulcus into the superior and inferior parietal lobules. The inferior parietal lobule includes the supramarginal gyrus, which surrounds the upturned end of the posterior ramus of the Sylvian fissure. Okay, so the inferior parietal lobule includes the supramarginal gyrus. This is a part of this inferior parietal lobule. Surrounds the upturned end of the posterior ramus of the Sylvian fissure. So what you can see here is that we have this Sylvian fissure, and the inferior parietal lobule, which is composed of supramarginal gyrus in part, which surrounds the upturned end of the posterior ramus of the Sylvian fissure. And we also see here the angular gyrus, which surrounds the upturned posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus. Okay. So these are just the surroundings and demarcations of the superior temporal sulcus. Okay. The lateral occipital sulcus divides the lateral aspect of the occipital lobe into the superior and inferior occipital gyri. So the lateral occipital sulcus divides the lateral aspect of the occipital lobe into the superior and inferior occipital gyri. The lateral surface of the temporal lobe behind temporal pole is divided into the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri by the superior and inferior temporal sulci. You can notice the lateral surface of the temporal lobe, which is placed behind the temporal pole. It is divided into the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. So these are just parallel one to another on the temporal lobe by the superior and inferior temporal sulci. So we have only two sulci and three gyri. Superior, middle, inferior gyri divided by two sulci. This is the superior and inferior temporal sulci. These are very important demarcations on the temporal lobe for orientation during surgery, also specific procedures. Okay, so now we see the inferior surface of the frontal lobe is formed by the gyrus rectus and the orbital gyri. Now we just return to the frontal lobe. Okay, so we see the inferior surface of the frontal lobe is formed by the gyrus rectus and the orbital gyri. The olfactory tract courses in the olfactory sulcus, which separates the gyrus rectus from the orbital gyri. Okay, so olfactory tract and olfactory areas are very close to this frontal lobe. Also, we see that the orbital sulci divide the orbital surface of the frontal lobe into the anterior, medial, lateral, and posterior orbital gyri. Okay, so the orbital sulci, which we mentioned, divide the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. This is the part of the inferior frontal gyrus, as I mentioned before. So these orbital sulci divide the orbital surface of the frontal lobe into the anterior, medial, lateral, and posterior orbital gyri. The inferior surface of the temporal lobe, proceeding from medial to lateral, is formed by the parahippocampal, occipitotemporal, and inferior temporal gyri. So the inferior surface of the temporal lobe, proceeding from medial to lateral. So we are now on the temporal lobe. So this inferior surface of the temporal lobe, proceeding from medial to lateral, is formed by the parahippocampal, occipitotemporal, and inferior temporal gyri. The occipitotemporal sulcus separates the occipitotemporal and inferior temporal gyri. Okay, so another sulcus is occipitotemporal sulcus, which divides the occipital lobe and temporal lobe. And this sulcus separates the occipital and inferior temporal gyri. The collateral and renal rhinal sulci separate the parahypocampal and occipitotemporal gyri. So the collateral and rhinal sulci separate the parahypocampal and occipitotemporal gyri. I know this is lots of information, but we just have to go through this, and later we will discuss this in more detail. Okay. So a narrow strip of cortex at the posterior end of the parahypocampal gyrus, called the isthmus of the cingulate gyrus, wraps around the splenium of the corpus callosum and connects the posterior ends of the parahypocampal and cingulate gyri. Okay, so just to continue this discussion, we see that a narrow strip of cortex at the posterior end of the parahypocampal gyrus, okay, called the isthmus. So this narrow strip of cortex is called the isthmus of the cingulate gyrus, and it wraps around the splenium of the corpus callosum and connects the posterior ends of the parahypocampal and cingulate gyri. On the medial surface of the hemisphere, the callosal sulcus separates the corpus callosum from the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate sulcus separates the cingulate gyrus from the superior frontal gyrus. The ascending ramus of this cingulate sulcus ascends along the posterior margin of the paracentral lobe. Okay, so we have here the ascending ramus of the cingulate sulcus, which ascends along the posterior margin of the paracentral lobule. This is part of the supramarginal gyrus. Okay. This is, yes, so subparietal sulcus separates the precuneus and the cingulate gyrus. These are the areas we spoke in our previous hangout. And these areas of precuneus and cuneus are very important because cuneus is part of the occipital pole and also the house and seat of visual areas, V, 1, 2, and 3. So the subparietal sulcus separates the precuneus and the cingulate gyrus. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the precuneus and the cuneus. So also parieto-occipital sulcus separates the precuneus and the cuneus, which I mentioned. The calcaneus sulcus extends forward from the occipital pole and divides the medial surface of the occipital lobe between the cuneus and lingula. Okay, so another very important sulcus, which is the seat of visual areas, is the calcaneus sulcus, which extends forward from the occipital pole and divides the medial surface of the occipital lobe between the cuneus and lingula. The paraterminal and paraolfactory gyri are situated below the corpus callosum, in front of the lamina terminalis and anterior commissure. Okay, paraterminal and paraolfactory gyri are situated below the corpus callosum, in front of the lamina terminalis and anterior commissure. The inferior surface of the occipital lobe is formed by the lower part of the lingula and inferior occipital gyrus and the posterior part of the occipitotemporal gyrus. Okay, so the inferior surface of this occipital lobe is formed by the lower part of the lingula and inferior occipital gyrus and the posterior part of the occipitotemporal gyrus. Now we are going to the more anterior region of the inferior face of the cerebrum, which contains the mammillary bodies. So I think this is depicted by best by figure E as part of this figure 1.3. Okay, so this here on image E, we can see these mammillary bodies. Okay, so the mammillary bodies and infundibulum are in the floor of the third ventricle below the foramen of Monro. These are very important landmarks for some operations in neurosurgery. For example, it is very important to know this anatomy well from the outside or from inferior aspect of the cerebrum, as well as from the aspect of the internal part of third ventricle. So one can know where to place the perforation, which is needed for, say, operation of the for shunting of the third ventricle in cases of hydrocephalus. So this is very important and emphasized in Professor Rhoton's lectures, collected in Rhoton collection, which is available online on YouTube channel of the WANS, and also on some other sites on the internet as well. So, as I said, these mammillary bodies and infundibulum are in the floor of the third ventricle below the foramen of Monro. The oculomotor nerves arise on the medial surface of the cerebral peduncles. Okay, so oculomotor nerves are also presented here. The optic nerves are situated at the medial ends of the Sylvian fissures. Okay. And this concludes our discussion on first figure in this series, and this is figure 1.3. Okay, so what we discussed here is the gross anatomy of the cerebral surfaces. We discussed the lateral, medial, and inferior surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres through 6 figures, which are presented here. And I hope you did get some general understanding of how these parts are interconnected. So what we are trying to see now is to get the gross total image of the anatomy of the cerebrum. And throughout this chapter, we will go into more detail. Okay, so Dr. Bennett, please proceed to figure 1.4 on page 10.
Okay, page 10. The next page?
Yes, the next page. And this is figure A of figure 1.4, part A, on the top of the page.
Okay, figure 1.4. Hold on. Oh. Okay, figure 1. The color pictures, right?
Yes, the color pictures. Great.
Okay.
Just place the image on part A of this figure.
Let me share the screen. Hold on.
Thank you.
Okay. I know you can't see it. Okay, so which picture? The top?
Yes, the top, the figure A, part A of this figure. Okay. So yes, that's it. Okay, so in this figure 1.4, we will discuss the anterior perforated substance and Sylvian fissure. Okay, so we are now already going into more detail. So this was the gross image of the cerebral hemispheres, and now we will continue discussing this with these beautiful preparations, dissections that are made by Professor Rhoton's fellows, and I think this is really a remarkable work. Neurosurgical TV also had the pleasure of hosting Dr. Perez, Igo Perez from Mexico, who is also doing some wonderful dissections. And we are very happy to also make these readings as part of this cover of anatomy in our Neurosurgical TV Hangouts. So I recommend that you also come to panel or view the lectures that were done by Professor Dr. Perez. Also remarkable dissections. Okay, so we have here on image A, anterior perforated substance and Sylvian fissure. So first we have the inferior view on image A. On this inferior view, we see the anterior perforated substance forms on the roof of the sphenoidal compartment of the Sylvian fissure. So the anterior perforated substance forms on the roof of the sphenoidal compartment of the Sylvian fissure. It extends from the olfactory striae anteriorly to the optic tract and stem of the temporal lobe posteriorly. So it extends from the olfactory striae anteriorly to the optic tract and stem of the temporal lobe posteriorly. On the medial side, it extends to the interhemispheric fissure and laterally to the lumen insulae. This is all very nicely depicted here. You can also follow the marks on the picture itself, these bold letters, which indicate which part is which. Okay, so the anterior uncal segment faces the anterior perforated substance. So the anterior uncal segment faces the anterior perforated substance. The posterior segment faces the cerebropeduncle. Okay, so posterior segment of this faces the cerebropeduncle. This was the image A, which discussed the inferior view. Now we are proceeding to image B. This is the image which shows dissection in which the right temporal pole has been removed down to the level of the stem of the temporal lobe that forms the posterolateral margin of the anterior perforated substance. So the right temporal lobe has been removed in this image down to the level of the stem of the temporal lobe that forms the posterolateral margin of the anterior perforated substance. The lumen insula, which we mentioned before, is situated at the lateral margin of the anterior perforated substance, anterior to the stem of the temporal lobe. So this lumen insula, which is also an important landmark, is situated at the lateral margin of the anterior perforated substance, anterior to the stem of the temporal lobe. On the left side, the lower part of the posterior uncal segment has been removed to expose the upper part formed largely by the hippocampal head. So on the left side, we can see that the lower part of the posterior uncal segment has been removed to expose the upper part formed largely by the hippocampal head. The anterior perforated substance has a salt and pepper appearance. Salt and pepper appearance created by small openings through which the perforating arteries and veins penetrate the hemisphere. Okay, so anterior perforated substance, this is a very interesting bit of cerebral tissue, which really has this, as Professor Rotten here describes very visually, has a salt and pepper appearance, created by small openings through which the perforating arteries and veins penetrate the hemisphere. So we can see here the perforating foramens of these arteries and veins, the vasculature, which penetrates the hemisphere and gives irrigation to these areas. The area where a third ventriculostomy, as I mentioned before, is performed is located in front of the mammillary bodies. So one very important notice to receive from this sentence is that the third ventriculostomy is performed in front of the mammillary bodies. So never in the back, always in front. That's interesting. And as I said, it was also very nicely emphasized in videos by Professor Rotten. This concludes image B of this part. So now we will proceed to image C, which is just one below these two pictures we discussed. Okay, so now we direct our view lateral to the lumen to the insula and frontal operculum. So the view has been directed lateral to the lumen to the insula and frontal operculum. The lower ends of the short and long gyri of the insula are exposed lateral to the stem of the temporal lobe and medial to the gyri on the frontal operculum. So the lower ends of the short and long gyri on the insula are exposed lateral to the stem of the temporal lobe and medial to the gyri of the frontal operculum. You can remember the frontal operculum which we mentioned before when we were discussing the surface anatomy of the lateral part of the hemisphere or its convexity. Okay, so this is the same landmark which we can see in this image. This concludes the view C. So this image just wanted to direct your attention to the lumen of the insula and frontal operculum. and discuss this further, these anatomical landmarks. And now we will continue to on figure D. So in this image, we can see the anterior view with the lips of the opening into the operculo-insular component of the Sylvian fissure retracted. So as I just said, anterior view is viewed on figure D, with the lips of the opening into the operculo-insular component of the Sylvian fissure retracted. The Sylvian fissure lateral to the lumen extends backward and upward, and between the insula medially and the frontal and temporal opercula laterally. So the Sylvian fissure lateral to the lumen extends backwards and upwards, and between the insula medially and the frontal and temporal opercula, as we mentioned before, coverings of the Sylvian fissure laterally. Okay. I will just, continue with this. The posterior perforated substance is located between the cerebral peduncles. So as much as there is anterior perforated substance, you remember the salt and pepper like appearance of the cerebral gray matter through which the vasculature of these areas penetrates the hemisphere. As well as this anterior perforated substance exists, we have posterior perforated substance, which is located between the cerebral peduncles. Now we will proceed to image image E. So please, I hope this is in view. So in this image E, we can see the lateral view of the right hemisphere. In this hemisphere, the frontal and parietal opercula do not meet the temporal operculum, thus exposing the inferior part of the long and short gyri of the insula. So, lateral view of the right hemisphere is presented in image E. In this hemisphere, the frontal and parietal opercula do not meet the temporal operculum, thus exposing the inferior part of the long and short gyri of the insula. Okay, proceeding to image F, the opercular lips have been retracted to expose the long and short gyri of the insula, as mentioned before, and the circular sulcus at the outer insular border. So the opercular lips have been retracted to expose the long and short gyri of the insula, and the circular sulcus of the outer insular border. Image G. Now, I will just ask you kindly, Dr. Bennett, if you can go to another page. This is page 11 of our edition, so we can continue our discussion on image G.
Yes, we will. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so on image G, we can see the temporal lobe, which has been removed, and the optic radiations preserved. Okay, so the temporal lobe has been removed, and the optic radiations between this gray matter and white matter bulk of tissue, which comprises temporal lobe, the optic radiations have been preserved. The lower margin of the insula is located superficially at approximately the deep level of the lateral geniculate body. As you probably recall, this is a very important part of the visual system. So one of the neurons of the visual system is located in this lateral geniculate body. And this is a very important consideration for certain brain tumors which can occur in this area. And often we have special radiology of this area today available. But Professor Rotten also showed this in his Rotten collection presentations on the cerebrum, which is called Navigating the Ventricles. And as he showed, these anatomical dissections done by his fellows are completely similar, but in much more detail as these radiological dissections. So it is really remarkable how ingenious these anatomical dissections are, and this technique in which they are done. And I once again want to invite you all to view the presentations by Dr. Perez, who is so kind that he will show you how these dissections are done today with the top technology they are using in Mexico City.
No, I just talked to him on the phone, Slaven.
What? Yes? Yes, please. What you said?
Yeah, I just talked to Dr. Perez on the phone. Okay,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yes, great. Well, Dr. Perez is really one of our most important mentors here, and his kindness in presenting this student chapter is really remarkable. So I really invite you to be a great man and professional presenting. Okay, what is also an anecdote is that Dr. Perez contacted with Professor Rotten, and he was always, very interested in Professor Rotten's work as well, and I'm very thankful to Dr. Perez for him for this series. Okay, so I will just continue here. As I said, we discussed this
G.
Lobe has been removed and the optic radiation is preserved. The lower margin of the insula is located superficially at approximately the deep level of the lateral genital body, the very important optic pathway nucleus, as I mentioned. The fibers of the optic radiation pass through the stem of the temporal lobe on their way back to the calcareous sulcus. Another the visual pathway, create the images located in this most posterior part of the optic pathway, and this is the calcareous sulcus. So this calcareous sulcus is part of the community I mentioned before, and it's actually like traveling to these areas, and it was the intention of this microscopic neuroanatomy. I think this is remarkable. Really enjoying the question. So the fibers of the optic radiations pass through the stem of the temporal lobe on their way back to the calcareous sulcus. So we had the lateral genital body and just discussion. We have this image H to discuss, and I and G, which will cover. Okay, I can continue. Yes, okay. So on image H, we see the inframedial view of the basal frontal and medial temporal lobe. Yes, the inframedial view of the basal frontal and medial temporal lobe. The white dot outline the fibers descending the form of cerebral pivot. So the white dot on this image outline the fibers that form the cerebral pivot. Black veins outline the crowded and lentiform nuclei above the inferior perforated abscess and basal cerebral. We also have here outlined the deposition of the cloud in the basal surface control. The yellow veins outline the inferior margin of the head of the fiber. These are all part of the hemisphere in order to give you, as Professor Rotten emphasizes, the individual vision of parts of the cerebral hemisphere. So the yellow veins outline the interior margin of the head of the fiber. The interior part of the head of the fiber has been explored by injection area. Okay, so now here we have the pathway visual. So injections out of the injection area. We see here the anterior part which can transverse temporal gyrus. The most anterior which sections out of the injection area from the posterior part of the upper surface temporal part, called the plane temporale. The transverse temporal gyrus sections out of the okay, so we just mentioned this planum temporale. The anterior part of the upper surface, called the planum polare, is free of gyri and has a shallow draw to accommodate the course of the middle cerebral artery. So the anterior part of the upper surface, called the planum polare, is free of gyri, so no gyri here, and has a shallow draw to accommodate the course of the middle cerebral artery. The lateral edge of the planum polare is formed by the superior temporal gyrus. The lateral edge of this planum polare is formed by the superior temporal gyrus. The stem of the temporal lobe, thin layer of vitally matter that connects the temporal lobe to the lower insula, is positioned above the lateral and anterior edge of the temporal. So the structure which was mentioned many times in the discussion today is the stem of the temporal lobe. And the stem of the temporal lobe is a thin layer of vitally matter from lobe to the lower insula, and it is positioned above the lateral anterior edge of the temporal lobe. And finally, figure J, we have the inferior view of the parietal lobe. So in figure J, we can see the inferior view of the frontal parietal lobe. The gyri lateral surface extend around the lobe of the frontal parietal lobe along the upper lip tissue. The gyri lateral surface extend around the lower lobe.
Yeah.
Form the upper lip of the fissure. The optic radiations aforementioned pass laterally from the lateral genital body, the very important nucleus of the visual pathway, and course in the roof of the temporal horn along the temporal stem and lateral to the atrium to reach the top on the medial aspect of the occipital. So the optic radiations aforementioned pass laterally from the lateral genital body and course in the roof of the temporal horn. So this is very interesting because the optic radiations form the roof of the temporal horn, and they pass along the temporal stem and lateral to the atrium of the lateral ventricle to reach the top locus on the medial aspect, and they finally end on the medial aspect. Okay, so today we discussed a few images and we showed some of the total anatomy of the three hemispheres, as well as some details
Slaven?
in which yes.
I can't really. The audio. I'm losing the audio. I don't know what's going on.
It's okay. I just finished my presentation for today.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Yes,
I really couldn't hear the last part. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. You don't have to repeat it. That's okay. Okay. Now I can hear you. Okay. I can hear you fine.
Okay. Which parts could you not understand? I can.
Well, were you playing a recording or were you talking?
I was talking.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll see what happens. We'll talk after. Okay. Can you announce where you're at and everything? And we'll talk after.
Yes, this is I just finalized this for today. Okay, reading Rotens.
Okay.
Yes, this is
Can
what I
you
wanted
just
to
can you just
present.
tell us
Thank
that? Can you just tell us that?
you. What can I just?
Can you just tell us that you finalized and you're done, and what you presented and stuff like that?
Yes, yes. I just said today we discussed some of the superficial landmarks of the cerebral hemispheres and how they are interconnected. So we just try to receive this gross total view and also to start discussing some more detailed structures
Okay.
in these areas. Okay,
Okay.
so we will continue the next time with these more microscopic discussions of these areas viewed today.
Okay, Slaven,
Thank
I'd
you.
like to thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Always looking forward.